All right, thank you so much for joining us for this sixth in the series of the Yale Development Dialogue's Economic Policy Lessons from History. Today, we're going to be discussing sustainable development on an urbanizing planet. These are virtual panel discussions hosted by the Yale Economic Growth Center, the South Asian Studies Council, and the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. I'm Catherine Cheney, a journalist focused on global development, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm joined by panelists Sunil Amrith, Kate Brown, Edward Glaser, and Rory Stewart, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. But first, I want to give a bit of context on why we're talking about this topic today. So throughout history, as many of you know, or perhaps may study, population growth and urbanization have been presented as a problem, whether it's about putting a strain on resources or driving the climate crisis. But historical and contemporary examples show us how cities can, in fact, mitigate sprawl, reduce carbon emissions, and in fact, foster biodiversity. And we'll hear some examples of that. Urbanization seems inevitable. And as one of our panelists, Ed Glaser, puts it in a conversation we had just preparing for this session, there's no pathway out of poverty into prosperity that does not run through city streets. Urbanization, again, is happening. So the question is, what role can cities play in the search for green solutions to poverty? Today, our panelists will offer different perspectives on what elements of urbanization are and are not conducive to sustainable development. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then we'll hear from each of them and move into a conversation. And I just want to remind everyone attending this webinar to please put your questions into the chat, into the Q&A function here in Zoom throughout the conversation. And then I'll know what's coming, what's resonating, and work your questions in throughout the conversation. So keep those coming. To introduce our panelists, first I'd like to introduce Sunil Amrith. He's the Renu and Anand Dhawan Professor of History at Yale and current chair of the South Asian Studies Council. His research focuses on histories of environment, migration, and public health across South and Southeast Asia. And he helped to put together this topic and this panel for today. So thank you, Sunil. We'll hear more from him in a moment. Ed Glaser is a professor of economics at Harvard University. His research focuses on cities, economic growth, law, and economics. In particular, his work has focused on the determinants of city growth and the role of cities as centers of ideas transmission. He has served as director of the Tobin Center for State and Local Government and director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston. Kate Brown is a professor of science, technology, and society at MIT. Her research explores where history, science, technology, and biopolitics converge to create large-scale disasters and modernist wastelands. The author of 4 books, most recently, Manual for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future. She's currently exploring the history of what she calls plant people, which we'll learn more about, who understood long before others that plants communicate, have sensory capacities, and possess the capacity for memory and intelligence. And Rory Stewart is a senior fellow at the Yale Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, where he focuses on contemporary politics and crisis and on international development and intervention in fragile and conflict-affected states. Stewart, as many of you know, if you've tuned into these past webinars, previously served as the UK Secretary of State for International Development, where he doubled the UK's investment in international climate and environment. So I'd like to begin with Sunil, who I mentioned is one of the co-hosts of the Yale Development Dialogues and really advocated for this topic as one to take on. So Sunil, why this topic, why now, and why is this something that benefits from bringing historical perspectives together with practitioner perspectives?
So if we think about where we've been so far in this series, we started with a couple of sessions on the pandemic and the implications of the pandemic for development. More recently, we've thought about green pathways out of poverty. And it seemed to me that this, the question of cities brings those together in very interesting ways, particularly at this moment. And I do think we can benefit very much from the kind of dialogue we've had between historians, practitioners, economists on the question of cities and sustainability in the context of development. So about a year ago, when we were about a month or 2 into the pandemic, I think we all saw these photographs and on social media and the news of wildlife returning to the city. There were photos of Delhi from where you could see the Himalayas for the first time in 20 years. And, you know, on the one hand, I think this was a wake-up call for so many of us who'd perhaps ignored the biodiversity that has always lived in plain sight in the cities that we inhabit. But perhaps there was also a sense that this was self-indulgent, that, here we were talking about wildlife returning to the city when people were suffering and losing their jobs. And in a way, I think it also, there was a backlash against it, as there always has been, this idea that green urbanism is in some ways an indulgence. And I wanted to think about the history of that in ways that I'm looking forward to hearing from Kate about that. Another way in which I can see this link is, we've been told many times, and I think we're all convinced that one of the root causes of the pandemic is the shifting wild frontier, the shifting frontier between human beings and animals, particularly wildlife. Again, we've tended to think of that frontier as being out there. But that frontier is also right at the heart of the cities that we inhabit. That frontier is in the food systems that feed our cities. That frontier is in the ways that we live. That frontier lives in the implications of urban density or different kinds of urban density. So I also wanted to touch on that. And finally, as a historian myself, I have been struck by the very ambivalent role of cities within the entire project of development since the middle of the 20th century. Now, on the one hand, precisely as Ed put it, every path to prosperity runs through the city's streets. And if you think about development in the 1950s and 60s, not just in the eyes of experts, but even if you think about, Hindi cinema in the 1950s, the story of development is a story of the leaving the countryside and moving to the city. On the other hand, I think we've seen in the second half of the 20th century in Asia and Africa, a very deep anti-urbanism. And I think you find this in India and China, this idea that the soul of the nation lives in the countryside, that the countryside is the place for sustenance and provisioning. And until the 1980s, you can actually see that India and China, to take those two examples, had much lower rates of urbanization than most economists predicted or that economic theory would have predicted. And only in the late 20th century, in a sense, did the shackles come off. So I'd be very interested in thinking about the history of ideas about the role of cities within development as well.
Thank you. And that's something I'm looking forward to hearing from Rory on also, what are these conversations looking like in development circles? But I want to bring Ed into this. And Ed, cities, as we've discussed, are often depicted as enemies of the environment. But your view is it doesn't have to be that way. So can you expand on what it looks like when it isn't that way?
Certainly, thank you. And thank you for including me in this conversation, which I've been really looking forward to. I want to jump off on Sunil's comment on the thread of anti-urbanism that often shows up in the developing world. Of course, Gandhi famously said that the future of India is in its villages, not in its cities. And I cannot tell you how many times I've been in a developing world politician's office and he's asked me, great, you're an expert on cities. Tell me how I stop all these poor people from coming to my city and screwing it up, right? That is frequently the line that I have gotten. And I think that that's a terrible mistake. Even not only obviously are cities places of economic prosperity, but when you look at the urban-rural life satisfaction gap, so the happiness gap, that gap is non-existent in the developing world, right? In the developed world. But in the developing world, it's huge. And the country actually where you have the largest life satisfaction gap in the world, in our data at least, is India. That in fact, India has the biggest gap between urban happiness and non-urban unhappiness. Now, one of the reasons why people state for being anti-urban is that they see urbanism as being antithetical to the environment. I sometimes call this the Lorax Fallacy, after the Dr. Seuss book, which depicts city building running roughshod over a natural habitat. And I think part of the reason for that mistake is a tendency to confuse urbanization with the process of wealth accumulation, the process of economic development. It is absolutely true that as countries get richer, they're going to use more carbon unless we do a lot against it, right? And that's somewhat inevitable, but we have to talk about how we can minimize that. By contrast, urbanization is really about densification. The economic definition of the city is the absence of physical space between people and firms. And closeness is a way of reducing carbon emissions, not a way of increasing them, right? Back of the envelope number that I like, and it's about 10 years old now, so take it with a grain of salt. But if the great growing economies of India and China see their per capita carbon emissions rise to that seen in the sprawling United States, global carbon emissions go up by about tenfold. If they stop at the level seen in wealthy but hyperdense Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by about 25%. No, it's 125% versus 25%, sorry. So it's really a massive gap in terms of this. Another way of seeing this is if you compare the brownest city in China in terms of its household emissions, as opposed to its total industrial emissions, it is 1/5 of the amount of carbon per capita than the greenest city in the United States. So there's really a huge amount of gap that's there. Now, why is it that density is relatively positive for the environment? There really are two main things that we see, both in US and Chinese data. The first is the size of the dwelling. Typically in cities, people are occupying smaller dwellings, even holding income and family size constant. And so those smaller dwellings just mean a lot less energy involved in heating and cooling. In China, they don't actually cool typically, except for the very wealthiest households, but they do heat. And consequently, the cities of northern China are much more carbon intensive than the cities of southern China. The second reason is, of course, moving people around. And this is a big tension in terms of bringing biodiversity into the city. That in fact, the strongest prediction of how much carbon you emit in your everyday life is how far the distances are between you and other people, between you and your job, between you and the places that you want to go. The more biodiversity that you bring in between people in cities, the more that you're expanding the distances between people, and the more that you end up having people to drive longer distances and take longer commutes in different ways. So for those reasons, there's really a substantial carbon emissions gap between people living in central New York versus people living in suburbs. So I think I'll stop there. But the central point being, there's nothing wrong with density for carbon emissions. In fact, it's a good thing for us to be close to one another. The challenge is, as the world gets rich, and I think we all want the world to get rich, how we can make sure that the world gets rich in a way that doesn't involve massive amounts of energy use that put the planet in peril.
Thank you, Ed. And to build on that point, I know Kate brings unique insights from her research and lessons from history. So, Kate, I'd love your take. As Ed mentioned, closeness and density can actually have positive implications for the environment, but how do we steer it that way? So what are some insights you have to share in terms of ensuring that urbanization is not in conflict with, but perhaps in support of preserving biodiversity?
Yeah, well, let's look at the past, as I'm an historian. In Paris in 1900, 5,000 Parisian farmers fed 2 million Parisians with leftover to be shipped to London. In Washington, D.C., where I am right now, soil migrants migrated up to D.C. from the south, where they lost their farms because the soil was exhausted and they could no longer produce. And they started farming their periphery of DC, in DC, but where they were allowed to live as African Americans. And they, tax records and housing records have an amazing fact that among people in this Anacostia region of DC, rates of homeowner occupancy, a significant indicator of financial stability, were some of the highest in the city, 59% in 1940 versus 33% for white residents. So Black residents of Anacostia denied equal access to housing, education, public infrastructure, financing, and jobs, were able to pay down on their homes when most of their white neighbors were not able to do that. And they managed to do that by growing their own food and trading some of it, locally. Look at the Soviet Union, 1990, I was living in Moscow, everybody talked about famine. Soviet agriculture had collapsed. Same thing happened in Cuba. But what did people do? They got on the commuter trains and they went out to the peri-urban areas. They had small plots and they grew their own potatoes. By 1996, 91% of all potatoes grown in Russia were grown by small plot gardeners, dacha gardeners, on 1.5% of the arable land in the country. So we're not talking about that we need a lot of space. What's really sort of amazing is that people abandoned by, or neglected by their government and manage to come up with their own technological solutions. These are not primitive people. The Parisian farmers used the mass of horse manure that gathered in the city. They used the urban walls to have wall orchards. They, in that way, created their own microclimates and produced their own soils. And they ended up selling those soils to farmers outside of the city. They had so many great nutrients. So what does that matter today? I think we have one of the greatest biodiversity problems we have right now is the biodiversity of the human gut microbiome. The people in the industrial north have this really streamlined biodiversity in their gut, and that has all kinds of health repercussions. And it starts in childhood and it continues into old age. So what we've basically done in cities and in suburbs and in the conventional industrial farming areas is engineered ourselves to the very margins of our environments. And so gardening puts people microbially back into their environments. And you can do it in very tiny spaces. We have these, or we've got records of people producing masses of food, 6 crops a year on 1/10 of an acre of land. So I appreciate what Ed is talking about in terms of density, and I don't think it has to annihilate the prospect of biodiversity. In fact, if you look at American cities, most of our, a good portion, let me say 30 to sometimes 50% of our real estate is devoted to cars, moving them and parking them. And most of those cars sit around 90% of the time. The cities of the future can't have cars anymore. I think the Netherlands have just decided to ban cars in their major cities. So what if this doesn't take an act of God, it doesn't take even an act of Congress, but just a municipal ordinance shift, devote that territory that's been given over to parking, devote it to plants. Every new apartment has to have a gardening plot rather than a parking lot. And I think we could have a whole new world.
I agree with you. And I'm curious, we hopefully in our discussion, we can talk about, while that is certainly an appealing vision of what our future could look like, what are the real challenges that stand in the way in terms of implementing that vision, which actually brings me to Rory. And Rory, we've heard that, urbanization and sustainable development, biodiversity do not have to be in conflict with one another. In fact, they can support one another. And yet, as Sunil mentioned, cities often play an ambivalent role in the project of development. And in fact, if anything, maybe there's an anti-urbanism lens that many take. So what was your experience working within DFID, now the FCDO in the UK, in terms of what this looked like in an international aid agenda?
So let me first preface by saying I'm going to start with a focus on the UK aid agency, but it's worth looking at DFID because it was one of the most thoughtful progressive aid agencies, and to some extent, the way that DFID looked at the world is characteristic of the way that many people in the World Bank and other bilateral agencies looked at the world. Mm-hmm. The first thing to understand is that at the core of the work of DFID and many of these bilateral agencies is the idea of focusing on the very poorest people in the world. Mm-hmm. In particular, the idea of focusing on people who are living on under $2 a day. And that means that so much of the programming is about trying to reach those individuals. That has meant, for example, a real fashion for cash transfers, an idea of giving cash to families in order to transform their lives, either in a monthly payment or a one-term payment to help them set up a micro business. Following on from that will be large programs, particularly around primary education and primary healthcare. And a lot of the energy of the agencies is absorbed in that kind of work. What isn't done by these agencies traditionally are very expensive, large infrastructure projects that's become less and less fashionable, right? There are other ways of funding that, some of that from the private sector, some of that from development banks. But by and large, the idea has been to take the emphasis off dams, roads, and onto the question of how you work with very poor people. Now, fast forward. What is the problem then that we confront? The problem effectively is that that model, right, of working with the very poorest people, basically in people's minds in somewhere like Tanzania, has a rural feeling, right? The general impression is that you're turning up in a remote rural area where people have very little access to services, and you're worrying about how to set up a primary health clinic or a primary school, and how to work particularly on, for example, agricultural extension, development work, making sure that people in those communities can get more crops out of a given amount of land and maybe get some loans to enable them to access fertilizers, pesticides, etc. But in fact, the reality of increasingly what's happening in somewhere like Tanzania is people are moving to cities. So you turn up in a city and you find that 85% youth unemployment. You find an incredible number of people in their late teens and early 20s who've swarmed in maybe swarmed is a bad word, but have come in very large numbers from rural areas and are struggling to find any form of job. And the city is expanding unbelievably quickly. I mean, one of the challenges in the developing world is that, take Kabul. When I was first in Kabul in 2001, the total population of the city was approximately 400,000 people. Right? Today, the population of Kabul will be up, pushing probably 4 or 5 million. And that's happened in 20 years. And when that happens, everything changes. Right? The water vanishes because you start tapping a water table, which simply doesn't have enough water to keep a city that size going. There is no sewerage infrastructure. There's no proper piped water infrastructure. Informal settlements are springing up on every hillside and often collapsing in landslides. There is no provision of public space. There's no green space. There's no parks. Nobody's really thinking about mass transit. There's obviously no underground system going in. There's no. So what does the development agency do? And they're the problem, and I'll finish on this. There the problem comes, which is that the mindset of the development agency is still very much focused on the very poorest people in villages and thinking about how you can change someone's life with, let us say, $40, $50 a year. Suddenly you are in the environment of Kabul or Dar es Salaam, where what is actually needed is literally billions of dollars worth of investment in laying the basic infrastructure for a functioning city and making some very, very difficult decisions, challenging property developers who are building very dangerous, unsafe, unsound buildings, thinking about how you could generate a sustainable urbanism, thinking about how you might protect some of the historical heritage of the city, thinking about how you create your green spaces, how you get people walking. And there is an enormous problem in mobilizing sufficient resources to do this, because this stuff is incredibly expensive. I mean, creating an underground system is an astonishingly expensive thing to do in any city, and very difficult for people psychologically to justify. You're in a very poor country. What are you doing spending literally billions of dollars, right, trying to set up one of these systems? And yet you have to do it. If you don't make that investment now, incredibly difficult to retrofit. I mean, almost impossible now in Kabul to work out how you actually put that infrastructure in, because so much rapid development has happened in the last 20 years that it's very difficult to work out where the space is to get the sewerage in, the water, let alone an underground system or a mass transit system. Okay, I'm going to finish on that because I want this to be more of a conversation than my lecture. But yeah, somewhere in the problem is DFID will talk about urbanism, but it will find it very, very difficult to make the types of investments necessary to really help Dar es Salaam or Kabul into the future.
Thank you, Rory. Well, that's exactly where I'd love to begin. I'd just love to bring any of our panelists in, hearing this challenge from Rory that the mindset of development agencies is focused on the very poorest living in villages, not some of the challenges in cities. Any thoughts from any of you, just reactions to why that is or whether that could change? And if it were to change, where lessons from history might be valuable?
I don't think that's a mistake at all. So I in terms of disclosure, I need to say that since we're talking about DFID, that I co-lead the International Growth Center's Cities program, which is DFID funded. So we certainly do have a deep gratitude to DFID. And I think that in terms of the flow of funds, at least given current development budgets, that's exactly right. On the other hand, it is also appropriate for entities like the IGC to do research, as I do, on infrastructure in the developing world, and particularly infrastructure in developing world cities, and to try and help those countries figure out how to make those, those systems functional. I mean, for example, Rory has pointed out the unbelievable price of underground subway systems. There's an old joke that 50 years of transportation economics at Harvard can be boiled down to 4 words: bus good, train bad. And in fact, bus rapid transit, particularly in the developing world, is a vastly more cost-effective means of working things. That being said, I think in a post-COVID world, there is a view that, at least it's a view that I have, that in fact COVID should be a wake-up call that the wealthy world should actually, especially the United States, should massively increase its commitment to developing world budgets. And that investment should be motivated primarily by concerns for global public health. And I don't think spending on roads is obviously part of that, but spending on sewers might very well be. If you have the view that, currently having unhealthy water systems leads to the proliferation of superbugs that are antibiotic resistant. And it is amazing that the work of my colleague, Dr. Marcy Allison at the Kennedy School finds that in Hyderabad, the number of women who entered the hospital simply because they were pregnant but were then tested for antibiotic resistant diseases, the numbers of them who had them in their guts was just enormous, right? So we are really sitting on a time bomb here, and investing in water could be a way of fixing that. So I think those forms of investment make sense. And I think it is possible that you might even want things that are more of a quid pro quo, which is you get the money in exchange for serious monitoring devices that actually look out for outbreaks of disease, or for the same type of hygienic policies that we had in the 19th century that kept animals away from humans, right? So part of the critical thing is we want to sort of separate out nature and humanity so that we don't have the sort of cross-species zoonotic diseases striking as we've, currently the whole world has been suffering from.
Any other reactions to that, Sunil or Kate? Kate, I see that you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think I'd go in the other direction. Top-down development, you all can tell me the history as well as anyone. It hasn't really worked. What I'm talking about are working class people coming up with their own solutions. So again, take these peripheral neighborhoods of urban America. People didn't have sewers, they didn't have roads, they didn't have streets, they didn't have garbage pickup. And what did? They took their own night soil, they took their kitchen scraps, they took the scraps from their animals that they lived closely with, not huge feedlots where animals were being fed antibiotics, but their own, 5, 10 animals, chickens and a hog, and they recycled those nutrients. They broke the metabolic rift that was impoverishing both rural areas and countrysides. Excuse me, when rural areas are impoverished, people flood to cities. As these new when the new sewer systems come in, where does that sewage go? It goes into the local water sources and creates these algal blooms, kills fish, another resource depleted, another biodiversity gone. In American cities right now, we don't have a lot of horse manure, but we have a lot of human manure. And farmers take that, that's cooked at really high degrees, and farmers use that. We don't really, it's called biosolids. We don't often recognize that, but we're growing food in human feces right now. That's a device that was created by working urban farmers a century ago. It's a good idea. I think we need to stop using the failed cities in the Western world as a model, as a standard for failures exported elsewhere. We've done that for 100 years. I think it's time to move on.
And can I ask you, in terms of if there is a model, so if the model is not these failed cities, Hong Kong came up earlier. Can we talk about what are the models to look toward?
And can I just come in here? I'd love to sort of bring,
Sure.
This is a fascinating panel. One of the challenges I found as within development is that although people would allocate research money to the sort of work that Ed is doing very well, is that this stuff is not mainstream in most of the people who worked in my department. Right? This is a little bit outside their area of expertise. So very basic questions on whether they are, very fundamentally, are you a disciple of Jane Jacobs? Do you believe that what you need to do is create cities with mixed use? Or are you supporting the kind of zoning that you see in American cities? Are not conversations that most development professionals are very comfortable engaging in and don't really have a view on. And if they end up giving money to the Ministry of Urban Development in Afghanistan, they don't have a very strong opinion on whether they're going to be guiding them towards a more pedestrian-based mixed-use approach, or whether they're going to be allowing them to develop huge banks for affordable housing a long way from the city centre. So maybe, Ed, do you want to come in on that? Or maybe this is a Kate thing. I don't know.
I can certainly say something. It's, I certainly have been a fan of Jane Jacobs all my life, and certainly all my adult life. And it's, being keenly aware of the failures of top-down planning, I think is important, but shouldn't make you anti-sewer, right? Those are very different things. And you can simultaneously admire the use of night soil by farmers in China goes back 1,500 years of sanitation being brought to Chinese cities by farmers coming in the middle of the night and taking that out. Nonetheless, the sort of work on, how the amazing mortality effects that clean water had in the 19th century. And there's just no way of doing that isn't, in some sense, top down. It was done by cities, not by the federal government. And it was enormously expensive. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. And I think it's just really important that we approach issues like global public health with a ruthless pragmatism that eschews any particularly ideological focus, right? And that means there are some things that are really best done by the community, for the community, in a way that is bottom up and creative. And there are some things in which you really do need to expect to do massive amounts of investment if we're going to get rid of the risks of global pandemic. But I will also say, just in terms of what you're saying, Roy, we are, the past 15 years have been great ones for urban economics. And we have had a flowering of fantastic young scholars who mean that, the next 10 years, we're going to have a lot more to say to whether or not it's to the World Bank or DFID on this than 15 years ago.
Thanks, Ed. I wanted to just piggyback on your point that, some things are best done by and for the community and others with massive amounts of investment. I want to bring some audience questions in here. And I think we're starting to get at this question, but one question coming in is, building on what Rory had to say, is the answer to push toward these large, expensive infrastructure projects? Should this become the focus of organizations like DFID? And we touched on this a little bit, and I think we have different views on this panel, which is great. Kate was mentioning earlier that this top-down framing hasn't necessarily been proven to work, and we need to look toward bottom-up solutions. And Ed was just talking about the need for both approaches. And just wanted to bring in this audience question on, would the way forward be for DFID and other agencies to focus on large, expensive infrastructure projects? Or I suppose to reframe, what is the most helpful role that development agencies could play? And I think each of you might have different views on that question.
Do you want me to start first? I mean, I think the first question really for any organization is, what is it actually good at and what does it know? I mean, you can over 5 or 10 years change the culture of an organization, but you have to begin by getting a sense of what it can do well. And one of the problems is that, particularly in development agencies, is that we are very driven by fashion. So every 5 or 10 years, we suddenly decide we ought to be doing something else. In DFID's case, look, obviously there is a strong argument for infrastructure, but the truth of the matter is that we've spent 20 years not really doing infrastructure. We don't have people who really know how to do dams and bridges and sewerage projects. It's not our expertise. We have people who have specialized in governance, who have specialized in healthcare and education, specialized in cash transfer. To some extent, if we're going to do that, one of the key things is to make sure that you're working with the development banks that really have the emphasis there. The other thing I'd say, given that we've referred a little bit to biodiversity in the title of this, is it's very important to understand that we haven't fully internalized the arguments of the environmental movement against a lot of what we've been doing in development. So it's remarkable that very, very progressive development professionals are still pushing for agricultural extension programs, which are horrifying to the environmental movement in terms of the types of pesticides and fertilizers that they're suggesting and the types of crops that they're planting. It's also true that there's a very, very odd discussion going on between our energy development people who are still pushing to develop heavy oil electricity generation plants, and compared to our climate people, incredible tensions between people in our organizations who want to build dams and new irrigation systems, and the environmental movement pointing out that these things are often going to lead to huge catastrophic issues. So it's interesting, I find, within these organizations that there isn't really a space for intellectual debate where these things are resolved. What you actually have is often two quite separate specialized departments deeply disagreeing with each other, but rarely actually having the opportunity to make these arguments openly and calmly in front of each other.
Great point, and a big challenge. This kind of gets back to what we were discussing earlier when Kate mentioned plants instead of parking lots. But in terms of how we get there, when you have people with different interests pushing for one thing or the other, including agricultural extension, as Rory mentioned, there are real challenges in terms of getting to that vision for the more positive role cities could play. Kate or Sunil, any reactions to what Rory just said? And otherwise, we'll bring in some more questions in a moment. Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like one of the biggest obstacles, and excuse me, Sunil, it seems like one of the biggest obstacles is that so much of development work and so much of the way we think of where economies should go is how do we turn people into consumers? How do we get, how do we sell more things and how do we get people to consume? Rather than thinking of people as, what do we do with people who produce for themselves, who don't really produce for markets, who aren't making anyone a profit, who recycle their manure, their feces, their seeds, their soils, who produce a good part of what they eat, who build their own houses, who walk and bike places. What do we do with them? I mean, we if we need people to be consuming to produce profits for other entities, that's our big obstacle is ideological, I think. Once we start and think about mutual aid and cooperative societies, then we have another whole realm, a whole palette of solutions to come upon.
I like that. Quickly, I'll just say, when Rory said that the space for intellectual debate is lacking sometimes. Kate, you just brought up a good point that when you kind of shift your mindset, it unlocks new solutions. And if we don't have these kinds of conversations, we don't even see those potential solutions. So go ahead, Sunil.
I just wanted to pick up on what Rory was saying, and Kate has also touched on in terms of the kind of disconnected thinking, and to turn that back to your question, Catherine, about obstacles. And I think we need to acknowledge sometimes that the obstacles are very serious ones. The Lancet's most recent report estimates that 1.6 million people in India died because of air pollution last year. And it seems to me that the specific problem of air pollution in a country like India, just take that as an example, is almost the sort of worst of both worlds, because you have that as a combined and conjoined product of rural poverty, including energy poverty. I mean, a lot of this is black carbon being burned domestically. It's about crop burning, but it's also about completely unrestrained automobile use in India's cities. And I wonder in which, what kind of problem does air pollution pose for development? I mean, I think that there are all sorts of ways in which, if we think about public health, we're thinking about cities, we need to be thinking about the air as well. And it just seems to me a quintessential example of how multiple agendas might be pushing in very different directions. Because, on the one hand, one of the arguments is that the reason why crop burning has increased significantly in India over the last 20 years or so is because of the Green Revolution. It's because of the third annual crop. It's because of the ways in which the nature of the agricultural system has been pushing in that way. On the other hand, there's this sort of urban-rural divide where you have the politicians in Delhi blaming Haryana and Punjab for the air pollution in Delhi, which is only really one part of the problem. So again, this is just a call for more of these kinds of conversations which point out some of the contradictions that I think are sort of often leading these negative outcomes rather than the kinds of synergies that both Kate and Ed in their different ways have been talking about.
Somewhat amazingly, the anti-poverty program, NREGA, actually appears to be somewhat to blame for air pollution. So this is the work of Patrick Bearer at the World Bank, that this very well-meaning program to raise wages for ordinary Indians by raising the cost of labor-intensive agriculture, shifted to move to capital-intensive agriculture that was actually worse for the environment. I just wanted to follow up on Rory's comment, and clearly I'm sort of I seem to be the most pro-infrastructure person on this panel, but even I am not particularly in favor of DFID all of a sudden getting into the World Bank circa 1955 kind of business. Mm-hmm. The thing that DFID can bring is the part of infrastructure that it actually knows, which is the governance part. I mean, infrastructure is not just about structures. It's about what are the institutions that you're using to manage that infrastructure, and what are the incentives you're putting into place to get people to connect to that infrastructure. And that's a ubiquitous problem in the developing world, that you'll build a water main and you'll have a white elephant project that people aren't connected to. This was exactly the same problem that New York faced in the 1840s and 1850s when it built the Croton Aqueduct, and thousands and thousands of poor New Yorkers didn't connect and continued to die of cholera. In fact, my great-great-great-grandfather died of cholera in 1849 in New York, 7 years after the Croton Aqueduct opened, right? You needed to have a policy in New York's case which actually penalized tenement owners who didn't connect to the water system to actually close that last mile problem. In some cases, you might want subsidies instead. But in any case, that is the business of DFID, is to think about things like that and to figure out what are reasonable lessons that can be drawn from the history, both in the developing world and in the developed world.
Thank you, Ed. So we've heard these. Go ahead, Rory. Please.
I mean, on that, I think also there is a question around community mobilization. I mean, an enormous amount of what works in Kabul and actually getting people to connect to water supply or connect to electricity or connect to sewerage involved some very patient conversations, almost household by household, and really trying to understand why it is people didn't want to connect, what they were worried about. Were they worried about the fact they'd be caught in some taxation net? Was it the cost of the connection that was putting them off? Was there some dispute with their neighbor over land ownership through which the pipe was moving? That too is something that is sort of counterintuitive in a way, that if infrastructure is often led by engineers, they're often people who don't necessarily have an intuitive feeling for how you work house to house in a poor area. I mean, I remember working with a sewerage engineer in Kabul who kept saying, a splendid kind of German sewerage engineer, who kept saying in relation to almost everything, but this doesn't make sense. Why won't they do this, right? And sometimes getting the soft skills to get around this question of, but this doesn't make sense. Why isn't this happening in the logical way that I expect is central.
Yeah, great point. I wanted to get your take on kind of circling back to what we discussed earlier, why this topic, why now? So Sunil mentioned air pollution and, the health implications of air pollution being increasingly clear. We also have COVID-19 serving as a wake-up call, and these interactions between human and animals happening in ways they haven't before. So we've talked about some of the challenges, right? These conversations not happening, or maybe some of these organizations not leaning into their skill sets for how they could best address this problem, or seize this opportunity. Do you have, what's your sense of whether, beyond this conversation we're having, or conversations that seem to happen kind of on the sidelines, right? Not in the mainstream, in terms of ensuring that urbanization and sustainable development are actually working in cooperation with one another. Is this an opportunity for real change? Do you get a sense that we're at any kind of turning point, there's any momentum here, that there's an opportunity? Or is part of the problem that this is going to remain on the sidelines, not in the mainstream?
Well, one of the most Google phrases in 2020 in Russian was, how do you plant potatoes? And I think there has been this return to, people are stuck at home, people are returning to their immediate environments and starting to sort of delve in. I think we now know that we can make changes at a lightning speed on a global scale in ways that we hadn't thought were possible before when it comes to a global public health situation. As Sunil's pointed out, we have global public health crises all the time that have to do with poisoned environments, but those are slow public health problems. We really only seem to be good when it's, infectious disease is immediate, it strikes a person, one day, and then the next day there's a major difference in health. It's the slow sicknesses that have to do with contaminants congealing in lungs, contaminants, going into flesh and slowly creating cancers and tumors, autoimmune disorders. Those are the problems that we have been really bad about dealing with, and that I would hope that the pandemic would get us to focus on. And then I think we would maybe reorient our priorities less to the emergency situation and more to the long, slow violence of environmental problems.
Mm-hmm. Great framing of why now is different in what we've learned in this moment. Did others want to jump in on that? I think Rory.
One thing I suppose that strikes me is in thinking this through, it's very important to try to put yourself in the mindset of somebody working in the municipality of a developing country and really try to think through what's going on. So that could include, for example, at an extreme level, corruption, Many people in the municipality are extremely poorly paid, and many of the decisions that they're making may be taking place in the context of them having multiple jobs or being under pressure from property developers. Finances, even in somewhere like London, a lot of very poor planning decisions are made because the Mayor of London is short of cash and wants to try to make money from property developers legally, right? Rates money, business rates money, revenue money, and will therefore authorize huge tower blocks in places where nobody wants a tower block and where they can see an enormous amount of problems, but that's the way they make money. Problems of the poverty of a population. So many things will get stuck because it's very difficult to work out whether you can generate an income stream. Will people pay for their water rates? Will people pay for their electricity? How do they do that? Problems of different layers of government. So there will often be clashes between this sort of sub-district level and the mayoralty, and standoffs on who has legal power to do what. And finally, problems of ideology. You will have often somebody may be very well-meaning. They may well not be corrupt. They may be trying to do the right thing. But in Afghanistan, the mayor that I worked with in 2003 had trained in East Germany. And his mindset was still very much influenced by his training in the 1970s and early 1980s in East Germany, and in particular his idea of what it meant to be modern. And a lot of what he was doing was trying to resist any attempts for foreigners to impose what he thought was an old-fashioned or and by modern he meant, a sort of extraordinary high East German modernity of the mid-1980s. Anyway, that's just some random thoughts, but I think locating it in the culture of the municipality and its mindsets is important.
I think that's very important, and I appreciate that point. I want to bring in a question from the chat that Ed generously answered in the chat, but for those who are joining us online, not in the Zoom, I want to make sure to elevate this point. So one of the questions coming in is, what are the mistakes or lessons learned from past strategies that inform future planning initiatives and public investment? I mean, great question, because that's exactly what we're trying to get at by bringing historians and practitioners together, understanding lessons from history to inform practice. And Ed, I wonder, not to put you on the spot, but do you mind just expanding on your, I think, very thoughtful response in the chat, and then we'll see if others want to jump in.
Sure. I mean, as has already been alluded to, the litany of development errors is just enormous, right? We have an enormous number of mistakes. I do not share the view that Western cities are, failures, but it is certainly true that there have been a massive number of mistakes that have been made. If I was going to pull the sort of meta error, it would be the failure to plan for the needs of humanity and a focus on structures as opposed to people when building. Ultimately, cities are flesh and blood. They are not made of concrete and steel. And ultimately, when you allow engineers or builders or economists to build for the sake of building, rather than to build for the needs of the real people in the city, then you screw up. And I think in some sense, that's the way to think about sort of some of the worst excesses of post-war urban planning. That being said, as we look around the world today, there are sort of two variants of this, one of which is monumentalism. And if you want an extreme version of this, you can look at Astana, for example, right? Sort of building vast towers to glorify the monarch, to glorify the ruler. It's an old practice in human history. I would say that most of the time where you see sort of large capitals, that they are guilty of it. But there's another sin, which is NIMBYism, which is opposition to any tall building whatsoever. And this is something which as much as I deride East German planning practices, it is also true that borrowing from Yorkshire is not particularly wise from Mumbai either. And yet the UK Town and Country Planning Act was indeed the model for Mumbai's Planning Act of 1968. And consequently, Mumbai has labored under a 1.25 floor area restriction, which means that the average height of new buildings has to be 1.25, which is massive. It doesn't stop. Part of the reason that was imposed was the hope that that would restrict urban growth in Mumbai. Of course, it didn't. It just led to a dysfunctional city. Now, as has been frequently said, I yield to no one in my admiration for the genius of ordinary Indian urbanites who figure out amazing things to do in places like Dharavi. but they have often been failed by their governments, which have often just made it too difficult to actually do the building, to do the city shaping that's needed to survive. And that's both of these errors are, the Scylla and Charybdis of sort of, urban growth out there. One of which is building for the sake of building. The second of which is not building because you have some ideal of some, city that you imagine that can only exist if we restrict people from adding density.
Thank you, Ed. I'm glad we elevated that question from the chat. And I was eager to hear a more expanded answer from what you wrote in the chat. I want to, unless anyone else wants to jump in on that, I want to bring in another question from our audience, which specifically narrows in on food systems when we talk about lessons from history to inform practice. I know that's something Kate has provided a few examples of. But this person asks, in many low and middle income countries, one of the key ways in which urbanization affects the environment is through food, because cities have to be fed. Urbanization often comes together with rapid agricultural intensification and the development of food, transport, and trade, putting pressure on the environment. We've heard some examples of this. Any insights on how aid can help feed cities sustainably? Great, very specific question. Any thoughts on that? I'll see who wants to jump in. Perhaps Rory or Kate.
Oh, do you mind if I?
Go for it, Kate.
Well, my sense is in this whole discussion is that, you can fix this and you can fix that and you can give $40 a year to someone. But if you keep producing and bleeding poor people, if economic systems keep doing that, there's always going to be a development problem, no matter what infrastructure you put in place. So I guess my pitch is for relocalizing economies, turning large scale production systems that make corporations phenomenal profits that usually go to big cities in the West and in the North, and making small scale productive streams. So what do urban farmers do? They produce local, diverse, organic food on marginal land with short market chains and few post-harvest losses. They use very few fossil fuels to do that. They don't dump pesticides and herbicides on their crops. They make affordable, nutritious, and fresh food that's consumed right there, 10 feet from where it was produced. The only problem with that system is it doesn't make Wall Street or other markets, big entities money. But it does produce wealth and wellness.
Rory, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm deeply sympathetic towards Kate, but I suppose the two issues that are normally raised in the policy conversation are anxieties around cost. That generally the idea is that modern industrial farming techniques and scale result in cheaper food for consumers. The second thing is that oddly, there is now quite a strong movement from part of the environmental movement against low intensity organic farming. So George Monbiot, for example, in Britain, is oddly a real supporter of highly intensive pseudo-industrial agriculture because he thinks it's the most efficient way of using limited land and it frees up the rest of the land for rewilding. So there are sort of two models. There's the model which I favor, which is closer to Kate, which is a more low intensity organic land use. The alternative model is that you sort of divide your country up between Kansas and Alaska. You go for the kind of crazy industrial agriculture in one place, and then you have these huge areas occupied by wolves in another area. And it's odd that actually the environmental movement can't quite decide which of those two models it wishes to pursue, and quite articulate advocates of environmentalism like Monbiot favor industrial agriculture.
I don't have any views on agriculture, but I do want to just point out the similarity between the argument Rory just made and part of the case for urban density is that by bringing people more closely together in cities, we leave more land alone for nature. Right. So you're in some sense, the mantra is if you love nature, stay away from it, as indeed human beings are very destructive species. I like to tell the story of Henry David Thoreau burning up 400 acres of prime woodland as part of his, enjoying melding with nature thing. The same point is about sort of living densely means less carbon emissions and actually means being kinder to nature and means leaving more land available for wild things.
Thank you, Ed. So I'm going to bring in one more question and then we only have a few minutes left here. So I'll bring up this question for consideration, but would love each of you to close with any key message you want this audience to walk away with. So the question is around what came up earlier, moving to a bottom-up view of this connection between urbanization and sustainable development. And the question is, with many governments now focusing on infrastructure projects, particularly in the UK, are there good examples of bottom-up funded infrastructure projects that we can look to? So again, just a question on examples, models. So would welcome any thoughts on that, but with just 5 minutes left, I'd love to just go back to each of you for a quick point you want the audience to walk away with, a call to action maybe for how things could be done differently, given that I think there is some opportunity here for us to think differently and maybe act differently on this topic. So we'll close with Sunil because he helped to bring us together. But I'll look to Kate, Ed, Rory, see who wants to jump in first. Any final thoughts? And if you have a particular example, others should take a look at as we leave our conversation today. There seems to be an interest in some specific examples and models. So Rory, can we start with you?
Okay, yeah. So I think that the thing that is important is to understand how unresolved these discussions are. Really important to understand within a bureaucratic department that we don't really explore the fact that we disagree. And there are suggestions of this actually in this conversation. I suspect that if we had another 3-4 hours, if I was being cheeky, Ed and Kate don't agree on everything. But often within a department, those disagreements are not fully brought to the fore. Mm-hmm. There will be disagreements which are empirical, right? Disagreements on what works. There'll be disagreements on priorities. So some people may be more worried about the gut biome, and another person may be more worried about income expressed in cash terms. But there will also be normative or moral disagreements to do with your entire conception of values, which very, very rarely play any role at all in discussions within development agencies. And so I think this is quite useful. And I think if we can acknowledge that although we share a lot and we agree a lot, we also disagree. And bringing up those disagreements is an important part of progress. That will be my contribution. Thank you.
I agree. Ed or Kate, who wants to jump in quickly? And we do have to keep our remarks pretty short here, but can I go to you, Kate, and then we'll go to Ed?
Sure. Well, just in closing, I think, these last remarks, I think we need to point out that the history of environmentalism itself is a little dark and very much an elitist agenda that we just saw sketched out. You have dense urban cities, that leaves you all of Alaska free for wildlife. Who gets to go to Alaska? Only the elite who can afford those expensive trips to Alaska, and everybody else is in their concrete jungle. I think we need to rethink environmentalism and think of it a new kind of working class environmentalism where people have on the ground made really sort of brilliant new technologies and advances and innovations that have been missed in plain sight. That's just all I'm trying to point out.
Thank you, Kate. Ed, we'll go to you.
Sure. I just have really 3 points, and I'll be fast. One of which is where I started, which is that this pandemic reminds us that we are all of us on this planet in this together. And in fact, if that does not renew the commitment of the wealthy countries of the West towards investing in and learning from and being part of a development process together, then it is an opportunity terribly missed. The second point is there is no escaping our urban future. Right, it is there, and even if you don't like it, and I very much do like it, I think that is, the best chance we have for cultural, political change, as well as prosperity, as well as a world of hope rather than a world of fear. It is there, and we need to approach it with a ruthless pragmatism, as I've said earlier, that is non-ideological and very much focused on solutions that improve the lives of ordinary urbanites throughout the planet. And the third point I want to make is that, yes, we absolutely do want bottom-up things as often as possible. But, you're not going to crowdsource a COVID-19 vaccine, right? It's something that's going to be produced with cutting-edge technology, and we need that too. And so we must not forget in our desire to ground up things, and I very much do believe in the Jane Jacobs vision of neighborhoods taking responsibility for their own, that we also sometimes need governments that work. Right. And in some sense, what we are seeing around us in most of the world with the COVID-19 pandemic is a massive public failure. And that we cannot respond to that by saying we're going to look for bottom-up innovation, we need to actually get our governments to be more functional as well.
Thank you, Ed. Sunil, we'll go to you. I think we have different visions of what to do in this moment of time, but agreement that it's a moment of opportunity. And so can you just give any final thoughts on, again, as we started, why this topic, why now, and what's the way forward?
I think one thing I've learned from this conversation, this wonderful conversation, is that the visions matter. I mean, I'm thinking about Rory as East German trained engineer. I think our visions of human flourishing at this moment need to be made explicit and need to be put into conversation with one another, and the sort of conflicts within that, I think, upfront and recognized. I think this is a moment of opportunity, but I think it's also a moment of alarm, because I think, I'm struck by what Kate was saying earlier. We've made quite clear we can respond to a pandemic, but there are crises that kill many, many more people than COVID-19 has so far, terrible though it has been, about which there's been total inaction. And I would like to see a sort of pivot towards thinking about some of those quieter, less sort of immediate crises, which have to do with the relationship between the environment and human health and human well-being.
Thanks, Sunil. Well, this is one of those conversations I wish we could continue, but we are out of time. So I just want to thank our panelists for their time and expertise, and thank our attendees for your time and attention and great questions. This is definitely one of those topics that benefits from bringing historians and practitioners together, and it was a pleasure to moderate. So thank you all, and we'll see you in the next edition of the Yale Development Dialogues.